What's up guys, today you're about to learn a simple and aggressive opening for you to play against white's first queen pawn move pawn to d4. And I'm talking about the Nimzo-Indian Defense. And the first question is, why not to play the standard queen's gambit? Well, that's a bit dull and defensive, but how about you playing something more aggressive? And that is what brings us to this Nimzo-Indian setup, when you do not put this pawn in the middle of the board, but instead you develop your pieces quickly, you pin this knight, and there is a very clear attacking plan for you afterwards. And by the way, this opening initially seems very complicated, because in this position there is literally any move that white can possibly play, and therefore it feels overwhelming to even try to learn it. But in reality, I've been playing this opening for decades, all the way till a Grandmaster level, and I can tell you that, especially on the level below 1800, that can give you a lot of quick, easy victories, and again, especially with the plan that I'm about to share with you, you'll see how easy it is for you to play it. Alright, so what are the pros and cons of this opening? The first big advantage is that your opponent cannot play pawn to e4 and control the center, because in this case it's simply a blunder. You're going to take this pawn, and since his knight is pinned, it cannot recapture. In this case, white is losing the pawn, and also his own knight on c3 is attacked. Now, what are the downsides of the opening? Well, if you play it in the US, an additional 20% trumps tariff will be imposed on your Chess.com account for playing an Indian opening. Bonk. But jokes aside, there are no downsides really. It's very serious, you avoid any opening traps, and again you've got a simple attacking plan after that. Now we'll talk about everything that your opponent can possibly play. Let's start from knight f3, the most traditional move, but your plan will be the same for anything else that your opponent plays. And we'll cover it all, including the London system. So here what I recommend is you go for this knight e4 attack. And of course, it's very easy for white to defend his pinned knight right now. He can do that with a queen or bishop, does not really matter. But you also have an additional strategic idea behind this move. You want to solidify the knight right there in the middle of the board, and that allows you to transition into your aggressive plan. Now, for the OGs, I've covered a similar setup that you can also get from the Dutch defense, the Rubinstein variation, in the past. But for this video, I just wanted to give you the best of the best lines for you to play, and also how to counter the London system, because now we've got quite a lot of feedback from you guys, and we do know what works the best. Therefore, in this position, white will typically play something like pawn to e3. Of course, they could play pawn to a3, forcing their bishop to trade, but as we'll see down the line, you're going to do it anyway. Therefore, it's even better for you if your opponent wastes time helping you execute your plan. Very often they will play some standard move, e3, and now you develop your bishop to this long, juicy diagonal, because otherwise it's very hard to make it active along the other diagonal, therefore you fianchetto it. Now your opponent will move the bishop one way or the other, it does not really matter, and then you develop your light squared bishop. From here you support this knight on e4, but long term you also put pressure to his kingside, as we expect him to castle there, and in most cases he will. Now notice that as soon as the king castles, it also puts the white king out of this pin. And therefore, as the king castles, there is no pin on this knight anymore, there is no king right there, which means that you got to be careful. Now white is ready to trade off your active knight, and you do not want that. Therefore, instead you'd prefer to trade off your bishop, but to save this great knight in the middle of the board. Moreover, since the knight controls this square, he cannot recapture with the queen as he would wish to, but he'll have to double his pawns. And now you castle. So that is the setup that you're aiming for. You've got a great knight, you've got this bishop hitting the king side, and also thanks to this pawn f5, it is easy for you to shift your heavy pieces, your queen or your rook, to the king side and to solidify this attack. Either the rook or the queen can go there, and now it gets pretty dangerous for white. Also, there is no easy plan for white to execute. Quite often they play something like this, trying to maybe attack you on the king side and also to trade off this weak pawn which they have. And now there are two possible basically scenarios for you. If you want to be very solid, then the real setup that you're aiming for is d6 followed by knight to d7, which gives you this very nice harmonious setup where pieces complement each other. So that is the classical setup. But if you want to be more aggressive, you can go for that kingside attack right away. And what I've noticed is that in blitz, that most aggressive approach typically works better, just because defending is hard, and indeed, like, it's very challenging for white to find correct defensive moves here. Therefore, also don't look at Stockfish. Stockfish tells you that, maybe white is fine here, but again, like, for a real human, finding correct moves is super difficult. Let's say they just continue with their plan, but it's quite harmless, it's just a pawn trade, nothing much after that. Therefore, you can just put the rook right here. Now, together with this bishop pressure, it starts becoming pretty annoying. And if your opponent tries doing something like this, kicking your rook out and then hoping to put the pawn right here and to kick out the queen, the knight as well, it all looks really bright for white until you play your next move. Rook takes g2. And what I love about this opening overall is that there are a lot of those really cool unexpected sacrifices. And after the king takes, you bring the queen out with a check, and once the king moves, that is a sudden checkmate from a double check. Another pretty common way for white to counter your pin is to bring the queen out, either to c2 to support this knight or to b3, which also hits your bishop. In this case, the easiest thing you can do is just to trade off. You just stick to your plan, you don't even bother thinking about anything else. Queen recaptures, which is a little bit better for white in this case because he doesn't have those double pawns, but fundamentally it doesn't change anything. You still bring your knight to the middle of the board, hitting the queen and winning a tempo. Once the queen moves anywhere, in this case it hits the knight, therefore we gotta be careful, you need to defend it. Now the knight is defended by the pawn, that's exactly what we wanted, and after that, normal development will continue one way or the other. You still develop your bishop to this great diagonal, and let's say this time white goes bishop d3. So let's also explore that so that you see different common attacking patterns of this opening. Therefore, you'll be prepared for the middle game as well. Let's say he castles, and now we go rook to f6. We're going for this rook lift. The rook can come either here, take aim at the king, or here, and target the other pawn of white. Now, there is a very classical mistake of white. In such positions, very often your opponent is annoyed by this knight, and he tries to go knight d2, offering an exchange of knights. And while in general, that makes a lot of sense for white, there is one critical drawback. White is moving away the main defender and frankly the only defender of his castling. Because if you look at this position, you'll realize that white's pieces got stuck on the queen side, while the king is left totally undefended right there. And therefore, you don't even need to take right there. You can just focus on your own attack. And you can go rook h6, take advantage of the fact that the knight no longer controls this square, and therefore you want to bring the queen out and checkmate him. And if, let's say, white trades on e4, for a second it feels like white outsmarted you, like he won a pawn, but in reality, after queen to h4, that counts with a double attack. That threatens checkmate in 1, with queen takes h2, but if white blocks that threat, then now this bishop on e4 is lost because there is this double attack. And you simply capture the bishop. Now white is already down a piece, but that's not even the end of white's troubles, because then you keep attacking on the king side, and you just win the game right here. By the way, since we're talking about a system, a setup, there is no need to memorize particular variations. Rather, I just want you to understand the system and also understand those common attacking patterns. Alright? And the other beauty of the system is that it's quite flexible. Let's say in this game white played pawn to e3. And black even reordered moves and just said, okay, I'm gonna think out on my bishop first. And it looks like just normal Nimzo-Indian defense, bishop b7, this time also hits the pawn, white plays knight f3, and initially it looks like there was nothing special. But as soon as white castled, black says, okay, and now I'm going to transition it into my system. He first trades off the knight to eliminate a defender of the square, and then lands his own knight to e4. It potentially hits the pawn, the knight is supported by the bishop, therefore everything's cool. And of course, you could say like, hey, Igor, but white can just trade it off on e4. Yeah, but that's great for you. You traded off his main attacking piece, that bishop on d3 that usually hits your king side, and that dark square bishop is totally dull, it can't really get out here because of all these pawn chains. Your bishop, on the other hand, is really great, and therefore, although of course white is not losing on the spot, but you obtain a very nice opening position as a result of this trade. And usually white will now want to do that, and that is right. Instead, something like queen to c2 looks a lot better to defend his pawn and to also attack your knight, but now we go with pawn to f5, and voila, we transition back into our usual system. Now, as we already know, if your opponent moves the knight back to d2, offering you an exchange, do not rush into trading. Very often there is something better to play. For instance, since the knight moves out of the king side, one of the ideas for you to consider is that the knight no longer controls these two squares, which enables your queen to jump forward there right away, for example with queen to h4. Not only bringing your queen to the king side to support your attack overall, but also to guard your knight on e4 so that white cannot easily take there and win the pawn after that. And if he tries to attack your queen, there is even a funny blunder that you can play right here. You can blunder your queen, and then on the next move you suddenly checkmate your opponent because of this long-range bishop from b7. And as you can see, white is kind of struggling to find the right plan. If he tries to move this knight away, that enables your queen to come forward. If he instead tries to develop the bishop right here, that only helps your rook to come forward as well, which was part of your plan anyway. Very often they push this pawn, but that doesn't really change the situation overall. You can still use the very same rook lift, and white cannot push the pawn forward because that's controlled by you. If he captures, I mean, you could easily recapture, there's nothing wrong with that, but in this particular case, there was a much stronger move for black to play. We still capitalize on the power of this rook and bishop attack, and black played knight d2, just to open up the diagonal for the bishop. And somehow, even though the move looks very absurd, like you just give up a knight and white can take it however he likes it, but in reality, black is winning the game. For example, if he captures it with a bishop, there is a sudden rook takes g2 sacrifice, checking the king, and then queen jumps to g5, taking advantage of the knight pin. Again, an unpleasant and sudden surprise for white, which leads to this checkmate. And instead, if white captures it with his own knight, then let this be our puzzle of the day. It is checkmate in 3 for black, and if you can't find it, please write it down in comments below. Some of your opponents will wish to get rid of this annoying pin right away by playing pawn to a3. In this case, we certainly take there, doubling pawns, and then we jump forward with a knight right away. Again, this is actually an unusual variation. Most players play differently, but that's the line which I suggest you to play just for its simplicity. Here you kind of attack this pawn on c3, but fundamentally you just want to stick to your opening system. And another very important thing to know is that if your opponent ever tries to play f3 and kick this knight away, of course we're not going to go back. This is in fact a very common blunder, because now instead of moving the knight, you've got this queen check, which fundamentally gives you a winning position right away. The king has nowhere to go, therefore g3 is forced, but now knight takes g3 just ruins his position, and you've got a winning game right away. By the way, if you want to know how to avoid these kind of blunders, even in Blitz, I've got a free masterclass about that. I'll drop a link down below, because indeed most of the games in Blitz are actually lost kind of like this, just after an annoying blunder. And in this particular case, the rook is attacked, therefore white's got nothing better to do than to take it. But now after queen takes h1, somehow we've got this unusual situation where it looks like all the pieces are still standing on their starting positions, but somehow white messed up and ruined his position already. There are very few ways that white can play that will disrupt your system. One of them is the London system that we'll talk about in a minute, and the other one is bishop g5, where they also use a pin on your knight, and therefore you can no longer play knight to e4 in any of these lines because your own knight is pinned. How do you handle a pin like that? I love using the zigzag method, where he moved his bishop out of his queen side, and therefore we're going to go there and use that drawback of his position. Start off with the move pawn to c5, which hits the center, but also has another hidden idea behind it. It also opened up this diagonal for the queen, which enables your queen to go there and to pile up on this knight on c3, threatening to capture it with a check to the king, which is going to be a big problem for white. And it looks like white can cover that easily by, playing the rook to c1 or queen to c2 or knight to e2 or whatever. But in all those cases, you've got another beautiful follow-up. And in this particular line, it's even more beautiful because it's a knight sacrifice, knight to e4. It seemed impossible for you to play that because there is his queen right there. But in reality, it is possible. His knight is pinned, can't move. Therefore, he's got to capture it with a queen. But now the knight on c3 is left undefended. You capture it with a check, also attack off the pawn. And after the recapture, now you come with a double attack. The king has to move, the rook will be lost, and you'll keep attacking. And of course, we gotta talk about the London system, because that prevents you from playing that Nimzo opening, and you gotta stick to something else. Now, in this case, I recommend that you use the anti-London system. We know what your opponent is about to do, and therefore we're gonna use something right against that. So first off, your opponent hopes for that rock-solid pyramid of pawns in the center, and we begin by destroying a little bit. After that, your opponent hopes for you to play d5 so that his bishop is active and he's got this e5 square for his now down the line. Therefore, instead of d5, you play d6. Now his bishop is kind of dull, hitting these walls of pawns. Plus you control this square, therefore his knight can never jump there in the future. Now, since your bishop cannot be developed this way, we fianchetto it, and you get kind of something similar to the king's Indian defense, but our plan will be even more effective here. Now, once both sides completed their development, you strike in the center with pawn to e5, putting pressure to his center and attacking the bishop right away. And in this case, most of your opponents will actually blunder. If they don't, you still get a nice position and you destroyed their London setup anyway, which is nice. But most of them will just calculate that he's got 3 attackers while you only have 2 defenders, and therefore this move pawn to e5 actually looks like a blunder. And he'll calculate, I take, he takes, I take, I'm up a pawn. But what your opponent misses right here is that even though, yes, he's going to win this pawn on e5, but he's also going to lose this bishop on d3. That discovered attack is something that your opponents typically overlook, and that's how you win a piece. you're attacking his both bishops simultaneously, and therefore white cannot save both of them. He captures it with a knight, it temporarily guards the bishop, therefore we trade off knights first. And now this bishop is free for us to take, therefore we go ahead and capture it. And now not only you're up a piece, but also you've got this very active and annoying queen, putting pressure here, and it's hard for white to untangle the situation without trading off queens, therefore you'll likely go into an endgame with an extra piece and hopefully will win it. And if you want to know a simple and aggressive opening for white to play, check out this video. This is really one of my favorite openings. If you want to improve your chess overall, head to this free masterclass up there, and I'll be happy to help.